Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Today we're looking at a set of letters from the 1630s that present a mind-bending paradox. We're looking at a man sitting in a cold, damp prison cell who insists he's living in a palace of gold. But more than that, we're going to unpack a worldview that is absolutely terrifying in its view of God, yet surprisingly modern in its battle with atheism. And I'm not talking about the intellectual debate of whether God exists. I'm talking about heart atheism, the practical, functional godlessness that, lurks inside even the most religious people. We're going to see how this prisoner, Samuel Rutherford, navigates the tension between an overwhelming God and the constant temptation to live as if that God is blind.
It's a fascinating psychological and theological case study. Rutherford is a study in extremes.
It really is. And the source of material we're deep diving into today is simply known as the Letters of Samuel Rutherford. Now, purely on paper, these are theological missives, but when you actually read them, they feel more like the diary of a man trying to survive a mental and spiritual siege.
That's a great way to frame it. These aren't textbooks. They're letters written in the heat of a crisis. And because of that, they strip away all the polite layers of religion and get right down to the bone. What is real? Is the world real, or is God real? And Rutherford's answer is, well, it's uncomfortable for a lot of us.
Uncomfortable is putting it lightly. We're going to get into his concepts of the time-turning atheist, the devourer or debtor, and his brutal description of the world as worm-eaten. But before we fully jump into the 17th century mind, I have a quick request. We put a lot of work into digging these insights out for you. If you like my channel, please subscribe and press the like button. It really helps us keep these deep dives coming.
So to understand why these letters are so intense, we have to understand where Rutherford is sitting.
Right. I mentioned a prison cell. But why is he there? Was he a criminal?
In the eyes of the king, yes. Samuel Rutherford was a Scottish Presbyterian minister in the early 17th century. This was a time when religion and politics were, they were effectively the same thing. King Charles I was trying to force the Scottish church to conform to his rules, bishops, rituals, a top-down hierarchy where the king was the head of the church.
And Rutherford wasn't having it.
Not at all. Rutherford and the Covenanters believed that Christ was the only king of the church. They essentially told the King of England, you have no power here. As you can imagine, kings generally don't take that well. So in 1636, Rutherford was hauled before the High Commission Court. He was stripped of his pastoral office, forbidden from preaching, and banished to the city of Aberdeen.
Banishment sounds almost romantic in movies, but for him, this was a death sentence for his purpose, wasn't it? Preaching was his life.
It was his oxygen. He called his pulpit his one joy. So he's sent to Aberdeen, which ironically was a stronghold of the opposing theological side. He's under house arrest. He's mocked by the local doctors and ministers. He feels useless. And in that silence, stripped of his public voice, he starts writing. He writes to his parishioners back in Anwath, to noblewomen, to other persecuted ministers. And because he has nothing else to do, he pours his entire internal life onto the page.
And the picture of God that emerges from these pages is, well, it's not the cosmic butler that we sometimes imagine today. The God who's there to help us self-actualize and have a good day.
No, Rutherford's God is massive, sovereign, and frankly, dangerous. He uses the biblical imagery of the potter and the clay, but he pushes it to its absolute limit.
Walk us through that, because usually potter and clay is just a nice metaphor for being shaped.
For Rutherford, it's about rights. He argues that the potter has absolute rights over the clay. The potter can make a beautiful vase, sure. But the potter also has the right to smash that vase back into a lump, or to make a vessel that is marred. And the clay has no standing to file a complaint.
There's a specific letter that really drove this home for me, and I honestly struggled with it. He's writing to Lady Kenmure. She was a wealthy noblewoman, a patron of his, but she had a tragic life. She had just lost a child. And you expect the pastor to say something soft like he's in a better place.
Rutherford does not do soft. He writes to her about God as the gardener. He asks her a hypothetical question. If you rent a clod of land and the landlord comes down and plucks a flower, maybe he plucks it in May, maybe in June, maybe before it has even bloomed, do you have the right to sue him?
It feels incredibly harsh. He's basically telling a grieving mother, that child wasn't your property. The owner just took it back.
It sounds harsh to our modern ears because we view our lives, our families, our health as our property. We think we have rights. Rutherford's point is that we're tenants. He writes, infinite wisdom is the mother of his judgments.
What does that mean exactly? Mother of his judgments.
It means that the specific event, the judgment, the death, the banishment, is born out of a wisdom so vast that we can't see the edges of it. He's telling Lady Kenmure that she sees the working of God, the pain, the empty crib, but she is too blind to see the end or the result.
So it's an argument from ignorance. We're too small to judge the plan.
Yes, but he frames it as submission, and he uses a very specific phrase, dumb submission.
Dumb as in stupid.
No, dumb as in mute,
Yep.
silent. He argues that if you truly believe God is infinite, then the only logical response to suffering is silence. Not angry silence, but the silence of someone who realizes they're out of their depth. If you try to debate God, Rutherford says you're essentially trying to be God.
You're trying to measure the ocean with a teaspoon.
Exactly. He calls us beguiled dreamers when we try to judge eternity with our inch and handbreadth of time.
Okay, so we have this granite-like view of God, absolute sovereignty. But here's the paradox that really hooked me. You'd think a man with this level of certainty wouldn't struggle with doubt. But Rutherford writes surprisingly candidly about atheism. And he's not talking about philosophers debating in a university.
No, and this is where he becomes incredibly relevant to the modern listener. He talks about heart atheism.
Break that down for us. What is heart atheism?
It's the difference between what you say you believe and how you actually function. Rutherford admits that thoughts like, if there be a God in heaven, assault his mind. He confesses that his heart often acts as if God is a myth. He isn't saying he intellectually rejects God. He's saying that the human factory setting is to live as if we're alone in the universe.
He has this character he describes, the time-turning atheist. It sounds like a villain from a time travel movie, but he means something very specific about human nature, right?
He does. The time-turning atheist is the person who has one religion for summer and another for winter.
That is such a cutting image.
It is. I think about summer. It's warm, the crops are growing, life is easy. In a religious context, summer is when faith is popular, profitable, or, socially advantageous. The time-turning atheist is the loudest believer in the room during summer, but then winter comes.
Winter being persecution, or just hardship.
Both. Winter is when it costs you something. Maybe it's social ostracization, maybe it's losing your job like Rutherford did, or maybe it's just the grind of unanswered prayer. Rutherford says the time-turning atheist vanishes in winter. They change their beliefs to match the climate.
And he calls that atheism, not just weakness.
He calls it practical atheism because if you only follow God when it serves you, you aren't worshiping God. You're worshiping yourself. You're treating God like a utility provider. If the utility stops working, you switch providers. Rutherford says that proves you never really believed in the reality of God, just the usefulness of the idea.
He takes this critique even closer to home with the fair-skinned professor. And just to clarify for everyone, in the 17th century, a professor just meant someone who professes faith, right? Not an academic.
Right. He's talking about the hypocrite, but a specific kind of hypocrite. This isn't the person secretly running a crime ring. This is the person who relies on what Rutherford calls negative holiness.
Negative holiness. I highlighted that term. It's the I'm not a bad person defense.
Exactly. It's the person who says, look, I haven't murdered anyone. I don't steal. I don't cheat on my taxes. I'm a decent citizen. Rutherford attacks this. He says this person is just a civil man with a white skin of morality. But inside, they're sleeping.
Sleeping.
He says they're sleeping through their lives because they have never had a sick night for their sins.
That is visceral. A sick night.
He's asking, have you ever been truly terrified by the reality of your own nature? Have you ever felt the weight of who you really are compared to who God is? If not, Rutherford suggests you might be a fair-skinned professor. You look great on the outside, but you're a practical atheist because you don't think God actually sees the inside.
He quotes that psalm, "The fool saith in his heart, there is no God." But Rutherford extends it. He says it's not just the fool who says it. It's the decent person who lives Monday through Saturday as if God is blind.
It creates a binary for him. You are either grappling with the terrifying reality of God or you're sleepwalking through a world that isn't really there.
Let's talk about that world that isn't really there. Because if God is the ultimate reality, then the physical world takes a serious hit, in Rutherford's estimation. He is brutal about the world we live in.
He is. He calls it this worm-eaten world.
This clay idol.
White ashes. Painted men.
Painted men is the one that stuck with me. It feels like he's looking at high society, the nobles, the bishops, the kings, and seeing them as cardboard cutouts.
It's a very Platonic view, filtered through theology. For Rutherford, there is the shadow and the substance. The world, money, reputation, comfort is the shadow. It's a gilded world, covered in gold paint. But if you scratch it, it's just rotting wood.
And the substance is God.
Yes. He uses this massive image to try and adjust our scale, he says. Imagine you could create 10,000 heavens. Just stack them up. 10,000 paradises of pleasure and beauty. He says they would be literally nothing less than a drop of water compared to one drop of God's love.
He's trying to break our addiction to the clay by overwhelming us with the gold.
Correct. He calls us beguiled dreamers. He says living for the world is like having a dream where you are a king. In the dream, the gold feels real, the power feels real, but then you wake up. Rutherford warns that death is the moment we wake up, and if you spent your life chasing the dream gold, you wake up to find your hands are empty.
He even dismisses the intellectual giants, Plato, Aristotle. He calls their philosophy delirium.
He calls it stuttering. He believes that compared to the uncreated wisdom of God, the greatest human minds are just babies babbling nonsense. But here's why that matters for him in that prison cell. It frees him.
How so?
Well, if the world's glory is just painted clay and the world's wisdom is just stuttering, then what has he actually lost? The king took his job, his home, his status, but Rutherford looks at it and says, you only took the shadow. You couldn't touch the substance.
That sounds great in theory. But we have to address the reality of his situation. He wasn't just sitting in a library. He was suffering. He was lonely. He was in pain. How does he reconcile this good God with the fact that he's effectively being tortured by isolation?
This is the core struggle of the letters. And Rutherford doesn't try to dodge it. He doesn't say suffering isn't real. He leans into it. He calls the cross a love token.
A love token. I love you, so here's some agony. That's a very hard sell for the modern mind.
It is. But Rutherford views suffering as Christ's wooing. He uses the metaphor of smoked gold.
I love this imagery. Explain the smoked gold.
He says, faith is like gold. But how do you know if a coin is solid gold or just gold-plated lead? You put it in the fire.
The fire being suffering.
Right. The fire melts the lead or cracks the clay, but true gold. It might get covered in soot, it gets smoked, but the substance remains. Rutherford says he wants a faith that has been smoked. He argues that the fair-weather believer, the time-turning atheist, has never been in the fire, so they don't know what they're made of.
He also uses a legal term that I think we need to unpack because it's so central to his identity. The divour.
Yes. D-Y-V-O-U-R. It's an old Scots legal term.
Means a bankrupt debtor, right?
It does, but it carried a lot of shame. In 17th century Scotland, a divour was sometimes forced to wear a specific colored hat or sit on a specific stone in the town square, the divor's stone, to publicly announce their failure. It was a mark of humiliation.
And Rutherford calls himself a divour.
He wears it like a badge of honor.
Yeah.
He says we are all drowned debtors to God. We are in so much debt to grace that we're underwater.
Why would he want to be a bankrupt debtor? That sounds depressing.
For him, it's the only path to freedom. He argues that when things are going well, we delude ourselves into thinking we're owners. We think we own our lives. Suffering strips that away. It forces you to sit on the devourer's stone and admit, I have nothing. I own nothing. I am completely dependent.
And he thinks that dependence is a good thing.
He thinks it's the only true state of being. He argues that only the devourer, the one who knows they are bankrupt, can truly appreciate the grace of the king who pays the debt. If you think you're rich, you don't need a savior. If you know you're a drowned debtor, the savior means everything.
And he claims that in that state of bankruptcy, in that cell, the presence of God became tangible.
That's the payoff. He writes about Christ coming to his bedside in the prison. He says Jesus drew aside the curtains and said, "Courage." He famously wrote that he found more of God in the black cross than he ever did in the fair flowers of prosperity. The suffering stripped away the dream of the world so he could finally see the reality of God.
Which brings us to the final piece of his worldview, the urgency. If the world is a dream, Rutherford seems terrified that we're going to sleep right through it until it's too late.
He is obsessed with time. He calls life a sand glass that is constantly running out. He calls it a span length, just the width of a hand. He calls it a post, like a courier riding a fast horse. It's here, and then it's gone.
It creates this intense anxiety when you read it.
Yeah.
He keeps warning people about the afternoon sun going down.
He wants you to feel that anxiety. He's trying to wake his readers up. He warns about the beguile.
The bug guy.
The trick, the deception, the danger of dying with the beguile, thinking you are safe, thinking you are that fair-skinned professor, only to wake up to black hunger. He's terrified that people are going to drift into eternity without ever having settled the question of heart atheism.
So the ultimate risk isn't just being bad. It's being wrong about reality. It's thinking you have time when the sand glass is empty.
Exactly. Rutherford is standing in that prison cell, shaking the bars, yelling at us to stop building our houses on the ice. He's saying, look at the clay, look at the painted men, it's all falling apart. Wake up before the glass runs out.
When we step back and look at this whole picture, Rutherford leaves us with a very stark binary choice. There is no middle ground in his letters.
No. There is the clay world of time, which is empty, dying, and ultimately a lie. And there is the real world of God, which is overwhelming, demanding, but eternal. You have to choose which world you're going to live in. You can't be a time-turning atheist who tries to have a vacation home in both.
It's a challenge that hits hard, even 400 years later. Maybe even harder now, because our painted world is a lot shinier than it was in the 1630s. We have infinite distractions to keep us sleeping.
And Rutherford demands we answer the question, is the paint enough? When the afternoon sun finally sets, will the paint hold up? Or will we be revealed as devourers who never acknowledge the debt?
I want to leave you with a final thought from Rutherford that has been rattling around in my head all week. We often spend our lives asking if we are good people. We compare ourselves to the neighbor or the news, and we feel okay. Rutherford suggests that's the wrong question entirely. The real question is, are we just sleeping through life with a white skin of morality? Have we actually grappled with the hard atheism that questions the very existence of the divine? Or are we just waiting for the summer to end? Thanks for listening to Thinking Deeper.